Welcome to our coverage of Chapter 5, Working with Students with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. This is actually my favorite chapter, covering the 13 federally recognized categories of disabilities. I have a special affinity for this particular group of students because I'm a member of the Adair County SB40 board. This is Adair County's local county tax that we levy and disperse in order to support persons with developmental and intellectual disabilities who are residents here of Adair County. So I'm involved in this supplemental tax money to support these individuals here in our own county. There are some guiding questions for your textbook reading that I want you to think back over. You can even sit here during this recorded lecture with the textbook in your lap just to make sure that you're refreshing your understanding. What is ID, intellectual disability? Be sure you're on track with that. And do know that we often use the shortened form IDD for intellectual and developmental disabilities. This has even been codified in the regulatory guidance issued for the most recent federal law, WIOA, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. So you need to be able to recognize ID and IDD and what they mean. The federal definition has now officially changed from mental retardation to intellectual disability. I have some old IEPs that I'm using in this course, and you may still see mental retardation, usually slash intellectual disability, because these predate the official final changeover in federal nomenclature. So I am not putting information in front of you that uses the term mental retardation because I'm insensitive to the meaning that the term retardation now has. I'm simply putting that in front of you because historically that was, until pretty recently, until 2013, it was the federal definition, it was the federal language, and then there was a 5-year period of phase-in, and so we now have only recently completed the entire transition to the term intellectual disability. Please be aware of that as you work with older personnel in your school district or older family members of your individuals with intellectual disability. It's not always intended to be disrespectful when they use that term. We have always, the terms for this particular disability become pejorative. And so across your 30-year career, I have no doubt that intellectual disability will also become a pejorative term, and so it will morph again. We have old terms that have now become jokes. Moron, that was actually a particular range of IQ scores. And we can see readily how that has become a pejorative term, when originally it was just a standard deviation it was a label for a particular standard deviation on an IQ test. So be aware that continuing sensitivity to nomenclature is required, but also granting a little mercy on nomenclature to those that we work with who are from a previous generation may also be wise. All right, so what is ID is your first guiding question. Make sure you're on top of that. What causes ID? And these begin to be some of the things that are hard to take. There are pre, peri, and postnatal causes. Most of you were able to handle that in your RAAs, but I don't want you to forget it. Genetics and environment, this is controversial to say the least. But we need to be on top of this research. This is one of the reasons to become professionals who regularly consume the research so that we actually know what we're facing when we're working with students with ID in our classroom, and other causes. There is a prevalence of ID that we document. There's a prevalence of ID that we would expect, and the difference is significant. The difference between what we document and what we would statistically expect is noticeable. We'll look at that in another slide. And then how do we as educators assess for ID? I'm going to be asking you to look at some of Missouri's criteria in your team exercise later on today. What organization is a leader? And here again, we see the American Association for the Mentally Retarded. We see that old nomenclature even in the name of that organization. I would also recommend your attention to ARC, A-R-C. It no longer, they have dropped the retarded language. It was an Association for Retarded Citizens, and they have dropped that, and now simply it has become ARC, arc.org. They are a very influential advocacy organization. All right, I alluded just in the previous slide that there is a theoretical distribution of IQ scores that we would expect to see based on a normal curve. Oh, there's that term normal again. But we're in a clinical area, and so we proceed as if normal curve actually means something. So if we were expecting a distribution of scores to yield the individuals who have intellectual disability, we would expect that these individuals over here would be in our population. But the number of students who actually are diagnosed with intellectual disability is many fewer than we would expect based on categories of the IQ score curve. We would expect 2.27% to be identified if we were using IQ alone. Less than 1% of our student population are so identified, and that's because most states, by law, we cannot consider IQ alone. We also have to consider adaptive behavior, okay? And we'll look more at how we identify and define adaptive behaviors. So there's the intellectual disability nomenclature sounds like it might just be registered on IQ alone, but it is not. It does decrease the number of students who are diagnosed with ID that we use other information to come to that conclusion. There's also a stigma against intellectual disability, and so it is common for some students whose IQ testing falls in the range that would normally be diagnosed as having ID. It's common for them to instead have pulled out what are some aspects of their learning that are dysfunctional that would qualify as learning disabilities. And so we have two factors happening that decrease the expected number of students we have in our classrooms with IDD. One is that we also have to use adaptive behavior scores as well as IQ. And the other is that it is much more palatable to many school districts and many households to define a student's dysfunction as learning disabilities rather than as intellectual disability. We also we have a growing number of students who are being diagnosed as on the autism spectrum, or as the nomenclature on this category is changing as well, who are being diagnosed as neurodiverse. And some historic overlap in intellectual disability we now know is being brought to educators' attention instead of intellectual disability as autism spectrum or neurodiversity. So we're kind of chipping away at the population base that we would statistically expect to be diagnosed with intellectual disability. We can use intelligence tests. By law in Missouri, we cannot use only intelligence tests, but intelligence tests, IQ tests, are one of the tools. For children, we commonly use the whisk. Some of you are in courses where you're experimenting with how to do the whisk, how to deliver the whisk. Be reviewing in your textbook why we have to be cautious when we interpret IQ tests. There are a number of reasons. Your RAA, I think, only asks for one or two, but there are a number of reasons. And this harkens back to our culture unit. Again, always and forever, culture and cultural competence is central to what we do. So be cautious when interpreting IQ tests and be sure you have mastered all the different reasons for that caution as enumerated in your text. Now, adaptive behavior skills is the other thing we can use to help us determine if a student is in fact a student with intellectual disability or not. Adaptive behaviors are the ability to perform adaptive skills. That means your ability to perform skills that let you adapt and pursue your daily life. There is some evidence that students with very high IQs have not such great adaptive behavior skills. So adaptive behavior is independent, largely independent of IQ. And that's one reason why Missouri and many other states require us to consider adaptive behavior scores right along with IQ scores when making these determinations. In Missouri, we use an adaptive behavior index that is called MOCABI. Missouri Critical Adaptive Behavior Index is what it stands for. Most people just call it MOCABI. This is a national instrument, and I think I'm seeing that it's based on a national instrument, but I think I'm seeing that fewer and fewer states are using this particular instrument. There are others that seem to be ascendant, but whatever the case, it's not just a group of educators sitting around a table and saying, oh, I think Johnny's pretty adaptable. No, that's not it at all. Or sitting around a table and saying, oh, I think Patsy can function in her day pretty well. Yeah, I think so, yeah. No, it's very specific, and there are specific behaviors and specific adaptations and specific accomplishments that make up this index. I've given you a link to this index on the Blackboard site, and in your teams, I'm going to be asking you to look at pages 3 through 8, particularly pages 6, 7, and 8, the later, more sophisticated entries in the Adaptive Behavior Index. I want you to take a look at those, see what you notice, and you'll also be asked some specific prompts in your team exercise later today. For students who do have intellectual disability, there are some kind of major indicators, major problems that we can probably just expect to need to help accommodate and modify and bridge for them. Students will have working memory problems, and so we're going to need to use assisting technologies or assisting strategies to help shore up that weaker working memory. Students are going to have some limitations in language comprehension and development, so we'll need to be aware of how to pose our classroom language in a way that is accessible to all. One of the hallmarks of intellectual disability can be self-regulation deficits. But this is not limited just to intellectual and developmental disabilities. How many of us as normmates may have some gaps in our self-regulation strategies? So here again, we're going to go with the universal design. What is helpful for students with intellectual disabilities in our general education classrooms is certainly not damaging to the normmates, or at least those who do not have a diagnosis in our general education classrooms. And in fact, strategies that scaffold and build self-regulation competencies are beneficial to all our students and most of our adults in a school as well. There are going to be deficits in metacognition with our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. That means the ability to think about their thinking is going to be somewhat limited, at least naturally. Here again, strategies for metacognition can be taught. You aren't stuck with just the metacognition you're born with or you come to school with. These are skills, that metacognition can be enhanced because it is taught. So this is again something that benefits our normmates as well as students with many different kinds of disabilities. Motivation, we may find some motivation shortcomings in our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As a member of the SB40 board, I'm committed to the position that these weaknesses in motivation are socialized, not necessarily a medical, physiological correlate of the intellectual disability. There's some controversy about that, but you should know that many of us who are working as advocates reject the notion that motivation shortcomings are part of the intellectual disability. And instead, we assert that they are part of the dysfunctional socialization that individuals with intellectual disability are often subjected to. So the motivation shortcoming that we most often notice in this population when we have these students in our general education classrooms is that they lack intrinsic motivation. They're so accustomed to looking to outsiders to motivate them, to structure their day, to structure their work on assignments, that the development of that internal core of motivation has been neglected. It might be that the development of the internal core of motivation requires more effort for these students. But at any rate, you may find as you're working with these students in your general education classroom that you need to be able to supply some external motivation while you're helping them to develop that internal motivation, that intrinsic motivation. So what are some educational considerations when we are working with these students in our classroom? How do professionals assess the progress of these students in both academics and adaptive behavior, because we'll be measuring both for their IEPs? And what are the benefits of early intervention? So educational considerations. Something that's very, very popular and very meaningful for students with intellectual disabilities, but I maintain also for students without diagnosed disabilities, is functional academics. It's all very well and good to memorize math formulas, but don't we want to use them? Maybe we sew, maybe we cook, maybe we do canning. There's ample opportunity for mathematics to be applied in these functional ways, ways that are authentically meaningful for me as an individual. Maybe we're an athlete, and so there's all kinds of math measurement and formulas that can be applied to the athletic events that our athletes might be participating in. Again, functional academics means putting the abstract academic into the context of a function, a daily life function that is meaningful to the learner. You can see that this helps us develop that intrinsic motivation that some of our students with IDD lack or may lack. But this is also good for normmates. Who isn't more interested in learning something when it has a context that is, when you can use it in a context that is meaningful for you? The Indiana Functional Academics Curriculum Framework that I've attached on Blackboard is very detailed. It's like a Missouri Learning Standards curriculum framework, only it is all cast in functional academic terms. So I need you to be looking at that attachment on Blackboard, and you will be talking about that in your teams later. Systematic instruction is something that is a valid and viable response when we have students with intellectual or developmental disabilities in our classrooms. This has some misunderstanding among Truman students. Systematic instruction doesn't mean lecture. Lecture is one technique that can be used in systematic instruction. But virtually every other instructional technique can also be used in systematic instruction. Systematic instruction simply means all the parts that you've been taught here at Truman are part of good teaching. It means we're choosing a method of instruction, but before we choose that method of instruction, we are selecting well-defined, behaviorally time-limited, defined target behaviors or learnings, okay? We are giving consistent instruction, whatever method of instruction we choose. We're giving consistent instruction. We are giving prompts and cues to help signal to the student. We are teaching foundational skills before we try to teach upper level skills. So maybe one of the adaptive behaviors we want to work in our course is the ability to pursue several avenues for seeking employment. Well, before we have an assignment where the student has to generate 3 avenues for seeking employment, we probably are going to want to talk about what is employment, okay? Foundational skills before progressing, not starting at the full-fledged version of the target behavior, but building blocks toward that target behavior. We're going to plan for the use and reduction of prompts and cues. This is scaffolding. We'll be able to provide lots of scaffolding at the beginning and then in a deliberate and planned way, pull back some of that scaffolding until the student is operating independently. And as always, we're going to monitor progress. We're going to use some of our curriculum-based measures. We're going to participate in progress monitoring for this student, both for the academic goals in their IEP and for the adaptive behavior goals in their IEP. So we're going to monitor progress, and we're going to make changes as that monitoring prompts us to do. So systematic instruction, you can see, could be any kind of instructional method. It's the instructional method being embedded in all these other contexts, components, and sequences. We do want to be masters of generating positive reinforcement. Whenever our student in either their academic goals or their adaptive behavior goals correctly responds, so that's not just gives us the right answer in a question prompt in a lecture, but also correctly responds to the self-management and self-regulation adaptive behaviors that we're trying to teach, then we want to be sure we have multiple ways of providing positive reinforcement, positive behavioral feedback. For our students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, we as educators do need to consider the full range of service delivery options. That means the general education classroom might be the place, the general education classroom with an itinerant teacher might be the place, all the way to segregated boarding school residential kind of facilities. The use of this kind of boarding residential facility for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities has just about disappeared. There's just so much danger in that. And it was so discredited with the Willowbrook scandals and all the other scandals of the 1960s. I don't really foresee that coming back. But there is a full range of service delivery options, and these do need to be carefully considered in IEP teams. So how do we assess progress? Well, there's the Vineland Adaptive Behavior Scale. This does seem to be ascending over the CABI. We use a version of that, the MO-CABI. There are assessment of quality of life measures. I've given you these links in your team exercise as well. I love the assessment of quality of life measures. I personally like to use the Charting the Life course assessment of quality of life measures. And SB 40 boards across the state of Missouri are very much supportive of these Charting the Life course worksheets and process guides. I think assessment of quality of life is something that surely is not good only for our individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but is this not something all of us need to do periodically? It's like taking a pause moment for life coaching. That's not just good for persons with disabilities, that's good for normmates too. Some of the things that we are required by law to do are to accommodate and in alternative assessments for these students. So we are permitted, in fact required by law, to modify scheduling, presentation format, response format. This is why sometimes students are able to receive assessments verbally. You'll notice that the adaptive behavior scale, the MOCABI that you're going to link to in your team exercise, it provides for either an educator, guardian, responsible adult, or the person with IDD, him or herself, to respond to the questions, to mark the document. It's very true that sometimes persons with intellectual or developmental disabilities cognitively can master the prompts and are able to articulate responses, but they may not be able to write, and they may not be able yet to read the prompts. So this is why we are permitted and actually required to permit alternate assessment modifications and even some alternate assessments, okay? For general education classroom teachers, knowing our way around all the ins and outs of this is not really essential. Your special education coordinator for your district will have this expertise. Special education teachers will have this expertise, and you'll gain that expertise not in this course, which is a sort of a survey entry-level course, but in some of your other special education coursework following. One of the reasons why IQ alone is not sufficient to diagnose intellectual and developmental disability is because those adaptive behaviors may actually be more influential in an individual's successful launch into adulthood. This is where we sometimes will see our cherished, super talented, gifted, blow the top off all the national exams, merit exams. We sometimes see these students falter in transition. Transition with a capital T refers to the period of time that a student on an IEP is receiving supportive services from the public school district that transition them, that help them go on after public school. And the transition goals have to be independent learning, competitive integrated employment, and or further education. So adaptive skills are what really make the difference in students being able to take the next step in transition. Transition towards independent living, transition towards competitive integrated employment, and or transition to further education. Many of our brightest normate students falter just at this point. I've given you some links here on transition to college. It is worth noting that there are some universities that run programs specifically for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities to experience the college setting. Sometimes these are very much like what Truman offers with our summer programs. Sometimes they are in fact summer programs, but other times they occur simultaneously through the academic year and intersect at a number of points with the academic program that is being pursued by the normate students on the campus. So there's a wide range of college experiences that can be open to students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We do have residents of Adair County who are receiving aid from the SB 40 board in our county as they pursue community college education. So never underestimate what your students with intellectual and developmental disabilities might be able to accomplish. It's a grave mistake to set our expectations too low. As far as going to work, there are a number of settings that public schools offer and you may intersect with in whatever your role as a general education classroom teacher becomes. There are school-based enterprises. A number of schools may have ag enterprises, beef raising, butchering, and meat sales that they may run. And students with intellectual and developmental disabilities participate in these school-based enterprises. Sometimes they are exclusively for students with IDD, but most often they are open to all students in a school. The meat kind of raising that I see a lot in our rural state often is spearheaded by Future Farmers of America organization and the ag curriculum, but it's open to all students in the school. And we do find students with IDD are frequently integrated well in these school-based enterprises. There's also sheltered employment. This is falling out of favor and no longer meets the federal standard for the definition of employment. In 2015-16, the WIOA law, Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, was passed, and it changed the federal definition of employment across all agencies. So across U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Agriculture, U.S. Department of Labor, across all agencies, it changed the definition of employment to be competitive integrated employment. Sheltered workshops are not competitive. This means that sheltered workshops are exempt from the minimum wage law. So sheltered workshops have been legally permitted to pay pennies on the dollar of whatever the minimum wage prevailing was at the time. It was not uncommon even just 3 or 4 years ago for individuals working at sheltered workshops to make $1 an hour, or sometimes 50 cents an hour, or sometimes a penny per part that they were putting together. And this was legal because in the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 1930s, sheltered workshops were explicitly excluded. Now, sheltered workshops provide a service that we shouldn't eliminate completely, in my opinion, although some states have. But I do appreciate what Missouri has done in that Missouri has started on a series of year-by-year increases to the hourly wage in their sheltered workshops, such that very shortly we will be equal to minimum wage. The wage paid in Missouri sheltered workshops will be equal to Missouri's standard minimum wage very soon. So that's an improvement that I think was long overdue, but we should understand that sheltered employment, while it may still be appearing on some IEPs, it is not competitive integrated employment and therefore does not actually meet the federal standard. Okay, so I've just used another term, integrated employment. Integrated means first we get competitive, so we're at the prevailing wage for that work in that area, in that local area. And at the very least, this is minimum wage. Integrated then means that workers with disabilities are not segregated. Workers with disabilities are integrated into teams, groups, pods, departments with workers who do not have disabilities. So we used to say that it could be competitive employment if a team of individuals with intellectual disabilities were a cleaning team at A.T. Still University, for example. Well, that might, and if they were paid minimum wage or whatever the standard custodial wage was at ATSU, then that would meet the definition of competitive. But if every individual on that cleaning team has an intellectual disability and no members of that cleaning team are normmates, then it does not meet the standard of integrated. So you can see where in just the last 2 or 3 years, the threshold for what counts as employment has changed dramatically. You may still see old IEPs that date where a student had an IEP started before WIOA was the law. You may still see in that IEP a lack of understanding of competitive integrated employment. And you may have people on your IEP team that you are participating in who are unaware of the change in this law. This is because this law was passed in 2015, but the regulatory guidance didn't come out until October of 2016. And what happened in November of 2016? We had a change of presidential administration. This was a federal law, and so it's at the federal level that all the action is taking place. And the Trump administration that came in 1 month after the regulatory guidance was issued has declined to support the law as cases are being brought against it, has declined to clarify any additional regulatory guidance, and is basically letting the law just sort of sit there on the books, languishing. So the anticipated educational push about how this law would impact what we do in schools never happened. That's why there are so many people still designing IEPs who are not aware of the competitive integrated employment definition that is the law. Even if it's not being enforced, it is the law on the books. So I bring this to your attention because you're going to be my spear carriers out there in schools and in IEP teams. You will know what we need to be aiming for. At some point, the Trump administration will be over, and this law is still the law that's on the books. And at some point, we will need to be understanding what it requires of us. And at some point, someone will actually be enforcing it. So across your 30-year career, the moribund status of this law right now is really meaningless. What's going to be meaningful is how the law will be applied 10 years from now, 15 years from now, 25 years from now. And to know how to apply it, you at least need to know it's there. VR is my last bullet point here, and that stands for vocational rehabilitation. Every state receives vocational rehabilitation funds from the federal government. This is part of our federal tax funding stream that supports persons with disabilities. In Missouri, VR, vocational rehabilitation funds, are channeled through DESE, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. VR has rehabilitation counselors who work with persons with disabilities to help them seek, gain, and maintain employment. And VR is one of the federal agencies where the redefinition of employment happened. So competitive integrated employment is now the default definition. If you are on an IEP team, especially for a secondary student, and no VR representative has yet attended a meeting, this is a red flag to you that something's not right. VR is supposed to have a representative and is supposed to contribute to IEP planning for this competitive integrated employment outcome goal that should be checked on every IEP. That's the first requirement of WIOA, that every student on an IEP be given the opportunity to explore competitive integrated employment. WIOA does not say that every student must end up pursuing competitive integrated employment. So some students may find the best fit for them is that sheltered workshop. And some students are so severely disabled that realistically there's not a realistic opportunity for them to pursue employment really of any kind, sheltered, non-competitive, whatever. But the percent of students in those two categories is very low, much lower than we had previously assumed. So the first thing for you as a teacher to note on IEPs is that the employment goal box is checked. And then to note, are we interacting with vocational rehabilitation? The independent living goal probably should also always be checked. And independent living is a movement that started in the 1960s, and it simply was part of the reaction against the institutionalization of persons with disabilities, particularly intellectual disabilities. The movement maintained and maintains still that persons with strikingly serious levels of disability can live independently in the community if they are provided supports. And some of these supports are services like a direct service provider or a direct service person, DSPs. These are people who may help a person with a disability get out of bed in the morning, perform their hygiene, toileting, and showering, helping them to get dressed to go to work. These supports can be public transportation to help get to work when individuals are not able to maneuver their own transportation. It can be job coaches to help them learn a position at a job, and then that job coach scaffolds by withdrawing gradually until the person is independently pursuing the job. There are all kinds of independent living supports that can be provided that help persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities and other disabilities live independently in the community. Sometimes this also includes modifications to structures, ramps. Maybe it includes medical alert systems, or maybe it includes telephones that are designed for the hearing impaired. Independent living, IL, we often will see it abbreviated as IL, independent living. But this is a goal that all our students with disabilities need to have checked on their IEPs. Missouri does have an extra safety net for individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. It's called our SB40 system. And SB40 simply refers to the Senate bill that authorized this back in the 60s, in the 1960s. The Missouri Senate authorized counties to have an election to vote whether or not they wanted to assess themselves a property tax that would then be overseen by a public board, and the money would be used to support persons in that county who had developmental disabilities. Adair County, about 80 counties in Missouri have this, and I think there's 108 counties in Missouri. So a good number of our counties have since the 1960s voted to have this tax for the support of its residents who have developmental disabilities. And Adair County is one of those organizations. I bring this to your attention as a general education classroom teacher because depending on the services your SB40 board provides in your county, they can be a real partner for you in the classroom and in the public school. There are ways, for instance, our Adair County SB40 board cooperates to bring technicians to our Adair County schools that help assess our students for assistive technology. That's one thing that we do that then takes some of the burden off of the school district for having to do. Our SB40 board also provides support for summer camps, monetary support. We pay the fees for students to attend summer camps that can help them with their adaptive behaviors, or sometimes these camps are to help them gain employment skills. So all of the progress on their IEP goals does not have to be provided by the school district. Some SB40 boards have programs that help you get supplemental support for progress on those goals. The Adair County SB40 board also offers a number of summer programs designed to introduce students to employment, competitive integrated employment, to work on some of those adaptive skills and soft skills and functional academics that make a candidate more attractive for employment. So there's a whole host of summer classes and school schedules and camps and fairs and this, that, and the other that Adair County offers. And we do try to coordinate with teachers in the 3 school districts in Adair County to get the word out. But you as a general education classroom teacher might want to know about these opportunities as well. I urge you in your positions in schools to check out whether or not you're in a county that has an SB40 board and to also make yourself familiar with what services and supports that specific SB40 board offers to its residents. So we're going to look at an IEP for intellectual and developmental disabilities. I've given you this attachment on Blackboard, and these are the things that you're going to be prompted to address in your team. What are the students' strengths? This is just one student. And here's a mantra you're going to hear a lot in this course. When you've met one student with intellectual or developmental disability, you've met one student with intellectual or developmental disability. Remember, the federal law, IDEA, requires us to customize every single IEP to each individual student. And that's in recognition of the fact that no two students with intellectual and developmental disability, even if they have the same IQ score and the same boxes checked on the Adaptive Behavior Index, no two students are exactly alike, and no two students need the exact same educational program. So when you have met one student in your classroom setting with intellectual and developmental disability, you've met one. Over the course of a 30-year career, you will meet 60, 80, and you'll begin to have a schema for how to work with these students. But you must always be aware that when you have met one student, you have met one. Here are some of the prompts you're going to be asked to consider about this one student with intellectual and developmental disability. What are the student's strengths? This is what we always want to start with. We want to have a strengths-based approach to all our students, particularly our students with disabilities who are often confronted with a disability framework rather than an ability framework. So what are the students' strengths? And you're going to be asked to consider this in the context of your future teaching goals. So music teachers, what are the students' strengths that might play out well in your music class? What are the goal areas? Independent living, employment, further education? What are realistic post-secondary goals? What general education options are in the current IEP, and what other gen ed options do you think might be appropriate? I want you to start practicing a critical eye. Sometimes often we underestimate these students and we define them out of some of the general education settings that they could benefit from. So I want you to bring that critical eye to this one IEP. These are the things you'll be asked to do in your team exercise later today to help you get familiar with the details of one case, one student with intellectual developmental disability. Thank you for your attention.